Well, does the UK government have a secret role in NATO's terror armies? A bombshell new report in the Grey Zone details newly declassified British files that shed scary light on the origins and the internal workings of what's known as Operation Gladio. Operation Gladio is a covert NATO plot that deployed fascist terror militia armies across Italy. So the big question is London right now doing the very same thing in Ukraine? Kit Clarenberg is an investigative journalist. He's the man that broke this story for the Grey Zone, and he joins us now. Kit, welcome back to the show.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Thanks for being here. Before we get into these documents, Kit, I want to go over, and maybe you can explain to our audience and help educate us on exactly what Operation Gladio is. That's Gladio. And how has NATO carried out these terror armies?
Sure. So, in the wake of World War II, the CIA and MI6 created this network of secret fascist stay-behind military units across Europe. The name Operation Gladio was the title given to the Italian wing of this. But the purpose was to create what's known as a strategy of tension, in which citizens would sacrifice their freedom for security, justify the existence of NATO and the presence of vast amounts of US troops on European soil. Britain led the charge on this. They effectively helped create NATO because they wanted to keep the Americans in and the Russians out, and that ethos kind of persists to this day. But yes, so I mean, in Italy, like this network carried out assassinations, bank robberies, bombings, like the 1980 Bologna train station bombing, which killed hundreds, injured vast amounts of people. This was carried out using explosives provided by MI6, and these militias were trained on British soil, and this operated in total secret for decades. It was only in 1990 that the scandal exploded publicly. This led to about a year of critical reporting in the mainstream media. It's quite remarkable. I mean, it would never happen today. And then it's just promptly forgotten about, I think, in part because there were three parliamentary probes in Switzerland, Italy, and Belgium. The findings were never translated into English. I mean, they were also heavily redacted. So particularly sections related to the US and British involvement in this. So there are, and the media's terrible memory that means that this has been essentially forgotten, but it has enormous implications for understanding all manner of events, phenomenon, and indeed, yes, the conflict in Ukraine today. As the Grey Zone reported in November last year, the senior British military intelligence officials are involved in constructing a secret partisan terror army to carry out terror attacks in Crimea and other kind of Russian or Russian occupied territory. So yes, I mean, this is hard. This strategy is one that is very much in operation today, and it's likely not only in Ukraine but other parts of the world too.
It's amazing that these documents were declassified. So what exactly do these declassified documents reveal about the UK's involvement in Operation Gladio and what is purportedly happening today now in Ukraine?
Yeah, well, so I mean, the files were no doubt heavily weeded before that they were deemed fit for public consumption. I mean, Britain has an intensive culture of state secrecy. Any information they don't want in the public domain, they can one way or another suppress it. So yes, that it's been released at all tends to suggest that there was a heavy cleanup operation. But nonetheless, they're full of fascinating nuggets. It's very clear that from the moment the scandal broke, the British were keeping a very close eye on the European media and what was being said publicly by politicians. There's a particularly revealing passage where an Italian politician who admitted that he knew about the existence of Gladio from 1966 onwards. He specifically asked the British for details of their involvement in quote unquote stay-behind operations in 1964. This was the same year that there was a planned coup involving P2, which is this fascist Masonic lodge, and was heavily connected to Gladio. Now, the fact that he was asking the British about for information on this tends to suggest that that the British were involved in plotting to overthrow the government, because Italians had, much to London's chagrin, elected a left-wing leader and administration, which the British and the Americans were not going to tolerate. So, I mean, in terms of it, relevance today, it is admitted, and this wasn't revealed publicly for many years subsequently. It is admitted by a senior Italian official that explosives were provided by MI6 and the CIA were used to in a variety of terror attacks. Now, we know that there is an enormous amount of money being spent by London and Washington, kind of off books, like using black ledgers for covert operations in Ukraine, but also it seems in Russia too. There have been a number of terror attacks in mainland Russia since this started. There was an independent journalist last year claimed that this was all being coordinated by the Pentagon's JSOC and the CIA. I think that one of the kind of benefits of flooding a country with secret arms caches is that you never quite know what's going to happen to them. It's stated in the declassified files that several ammunition and explosive dumps that were created by the British and the Americans in Italy, the arsenals went missing. So that's kind of left to the imagination what might happen. But the British and the Americans obviously knew that this was a likely or at least possible eventuality, and they don't seem to have been particularly concerned. Again, it's a way of creating chaos. Strategy of tension. People are frightened to leave their homes, and beg the state to spy on them more intensively. I mean, I think as well that there are all sorts of references which which made clear that the British knew a lot more than they've ever admitted publicly. So, for instance, in 1978, Aldo Moro, who was the kind of centre-left Italian prime minister, he was kidnapped by this militant left-wing organisation known as the Red Brigades, and he was held in captivity for 2 months. And then when it became apparent that the Italian government was not going to negotiate with them or release its operatives from prison in return for Moro, they killed him, and they left his body in a car by a river for the police to find. It seems, yes, pretty flagrant from the files that Britain knew exactly what had happened, and that there was the aforementioned P2. Its operatives, which included, it was like a who's who of Italian spooks and financiers and industrialists and police officers and top military brass. They were involved in the crisis committee responsible for finding Moro. Ergo, they deliberately sabotaged their own investigation to ensure that he wouldn't be found, and yes, that he would be killed. There are indications that the Red Brigade was heavily infiltrated by P2, and they were specifically pushing the group to carry out violent acts in order to discredit the left and justify fascism. I mean, that's quite remarkable. And yes, there are all sorts of unanswered questions about Moro's kidnapping today. And lots of speculation and innuendo. I mean, the British seem to have had an inside view of what happened, at the time, which does tend to suggest that they were either involved in its planning or they were, apprised of its dimensions at the time.
So when we talk about Ukraine, you mentioned Crimea, and of course, to maybe dive more deeply into how this is being operated in Ukraine. If I understand it correctly, the idea is you have this sort of stay-behind terror group that acts as if, they're totally separate from the UK, they're totally separate from NATO on the surface. They're there to foment discontent, they're there to carry out terror attacks. So it looks as if it's being carried out by Russia, or it's being carried out by some other nefarious group, and therefore you need us, NATO, to be here to secure your safety, right? Even though we're the ones carrying out the terror attacks, right? That's how this is going. That's basically what this is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Richard Sackler, who's a leading academic on Russia, has a great line, which is that NATO exists to protect against security threats its existence creates. So, I mean, which is quite remarkable. But and that's without even factoring in that that NATO has a history of sponsoring terrorist attacks and massacres in order to justify its effective occupation of Europe. So what I find it very interesting that if NATO was truly committed to security, let alone protecting the sovereignty of Ukraine, why they haven't just let Kiev in. Despite the fact that the comedian in charge has repeatedly asked, very publicly, you might think that if they were truly committed to those principles, they would accept them in a heartbeat. That's not going to happen. It's likely not going to happen after the war ends. If that day ever comes at this rate, it's quite remarkable. But yes, one of we see this in. The kind of the annual earnings reports, but on major weapons manufacturers and defense contractors, they openly talk about how tensions in Eastern Europe and indeed in the Pacific are their key profit drivers. Since the war in Ukraine began, the profits and indeed the share price of Raytheon et al. Have skyrocketed. This is fantastic business for them. So why would they want it to stop?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, they'll continue this. It's a great point you bring up about, well, if you want the security, why isn't Ukraine a part of NATO already? But they'll just use them. They'll just use them as a proving ground for weapons testing from here on out. Kit Clarenberg, thank you so much for this report. You can read the full report. We'll link it up in the description below. It's at thegrayzone.com, which of course continues to be one of the best investigative journalist websites and news organizations in the world. Kit, thank you for your reporting on this.
God bless you. Thanks.
Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.